Okay, well, thanks everybody. It's Holocaust Remembrance Week. I've really never spoken on Holocaust Remembrance Week before. I feel it's sort of like a very heavy burden to do so. So what's my connection to the Hasidism and what's my connection to this topic? I read this book recently. I would say there's a number of books that are influence on me for this topic, but I think this book, Hasidic Responses to the Holocaust in the Light of Hasidic Thought, it's by Pesach Schindler. It's an interesting book. It's basically a survey about a lot of the topics I'm going to talk about tonight. But it wasn't my only resource. It's a secondary source, and there are primary sources which I think are more chashuv to me, have more influence on me. I'm an Orthodox person, very open to learning from everybody. I'm getting a master's of theology at the University of Toronto, so I learn from all sorts of different people and different religions, and I like those dialogues about important stuff. But I would say my soul is Hasidic, meaning is that I found that as I was becoming more interested in intellectually learning about Judaism, my soul wasn't really touched until I started learning the Hasidic thoughts. I feel there's a very humanistic element to Hasidic thought, a lot of love, and also quite deep philosophies. And I kind of felt that it was something that just spoke to me. So a few of those philosophies will make its way into here tonight, but I don't want to speak so much about my own journey, so much as the bigger topic about Hasidic responses to the Holocaust. So why is Hasidic thought, why is Hasidus important for the Holocaust? Like, generally when people think Hasidic, they maybe just think about a Lubavitch, Chabad house or something like that. But the reality is, the Holocaust is primarily a European event. We'll talk later, there were some Sephardic communities that were affected, such as Salonika, Greece. And more Sephardim would have been murdered as well if the Nazis had their way in North Africa and made their way into Israel at the time. It was called Palestine at the time. But generally, it was mainly a European event as far as the actual Shoah was concerned. And Hasidic thought was the primary spiritual and religious practice of the Jews of Europe. So it makes sense that we explore of the people who are affected the most, what does Hasidic thought teach? How did Hasidic thought prepare the people of Europe for what was going to happen? And how did they react to it? We're going to ask that as a question, is like, how did Hasidic thought benefit the people, help them with coping with the Holocaust? And maybe it also detracted as well. Maybe there were things about Hasidic thought that wasn't prepared for what actually ended up happening there. So we're not gonna shy away from being critical as well about that maybe some parts of Hasidic thought wasn't prepared to deal with the realities of there. And I'm sure you guys have some illusions, ideas about what that might be, and we'll talk about that later there. Now, Hasidim obviously weren't the only people that were affected by the Holocaust. Every Jew, no matter how religious or how secular you were, wherever you were, was affected by the Holocaust. And there were also, among the religious, there were also Sephardim, Misnagdim, the Litvish path, and Yakis, the German path. But there were also a lot of secular Jews. And Jews were basically, a large majority of Jews in the western parts of Europe, particularly like Germany, Hungary, which I guess is Central Europe, France, etc. A lot of them were not religious by this time, and we'll see how that may have affected or how that influences our subject matter. But as far as, let's say, the biggest religious philosophy of the people who are affected, Hasidut is going to be the most primary religious philosophy that was involved in the Holocaust. So it's we don't not understand that today, being modern Jews living in the U.S. or Canada or whatever. But in seeing Hasidic people, either from your Chabad house or really most Hasidic people really live in Israel or they live in New York or New Jersey. You have some Samer Hasidim here in Tucson. When I arrived a couple of days ago, I saw a couple Hasidic women getting off the airplane as well. But that was the majority of Jews in Europe as far as Eastern Europe in the religious thought, though there were a lot of secular Jews as well, obviously. Okay. So, how does the unique philosophy of Hasidus view the event of the Holocaust and cope with it? So, I'm just going to start briefly and give a little background about what Hasidus is, hopefully not more than 2 minutes, and it's leading up to the Holocaust. By the way, anyone can raise your hand at any time, or we can talk about this, make this a discussion. It doesn't have to be like a lecture. I'm open to your guys' thoughts, and at the end, we'll open up to some questions, including anyone who's on Zoom. Thank you guys for coming. Okay. So Hasidic belief was, again, also very much an Eastern European thing. Everyone knows it started with the Israel Baal Shem Tov, and it was a folk movement primarily. It was not. People kind of tend to think Hasidic movement was not an intellectual movement. They tend to think of it as a very folksy movement, of simple people, and that is true. But the leaders of Hasidic world were always, the Rebbes were always giants in Torah thought. They were always huge philosophers, huge scholars. But the unique thing about Hasidic thought is, and at least the legends go, is that they said that the most scholars of Judaism were very removed from the people. And Hasidic thought was really sort of egalitarian for its time, not egalitarian in what you'd call egalitarian now, but egalitarian for its time in the sense that it really championed every person. Every person was involved in Hasidic philosophy. So the big philosophies of Hasidus that were unique, that stood out. Now, all these ideas existed before, but what made it unique at the time was the emphasis. The emphasis was on simcha, meaning joy, acceptance of one's lot, again, glorification of the simple person, saying that person was holy and close to God. You didn't have to be a scholar or a rich person to be close to God. Every person was valuable. As far as spiritual religious values, I think one of the main thoughts of Hasidic emphasis was on devekus, which means clinging, getting close to God. And that could be through things such as meditations, talking to God in your own private language, on your own, what Rabbi Nachman calls hisbodedut or hisbodedus, things like that. There was definitely a Kabbalistic element. A lot of scholars believe that Hasidic thought was a reaction to the Shabbatian movement, and that the Kabbalistic elements of the Shabbatian movement really caused a lot of problems, a lot of pain and suffering among the Jewish people. But Hasidic movement was sort of a reaction of trying to bring these deep Kabbalistic teachings, which had been revealed in the 15th century and earlier as well, into the mainstream in a kosher way. So Hasidic thought is very influenced by Kabbalah, and when we get to the philosophies, we're going to see that. And the last, I would say, very important idea, which is really emphasized by the Baal Shem Tov, was hashgacha pratit, or hashgacha pratis. And that was an idea that really almost every Jew kind of believes nowadays, but actually was not the majority opinion. And what I mean by hashgacha pratis is that the Baal Shem Tov said that every single detail of reality, God is involved in that. Everything. He was famous to say that, a leaf doesn't fall from a tree unless God wills it. And generally most folk Judaism, really every person believes this. This is what God wants. This is what God thinks. This is from God. Everything's from God. But surprisingly enough, if you study the Rishonim, the medieval Jewish scholars, that wasn't really necessarily what everybody believed. Others believed that God may be involved in the world, but God's also more removed from the world, and that generally the world goes according to its way. Now, we can already see how this can have a big effect on Holocaust thinking. So let's get right to our topic, right? If you believe that God is involved in every single detail of creation, meaning is like everything that's happening in this room, as we're doing, every molecule is infused with God's light and purpose at all moments, then clearly you're going to see an event as tremendous as the Holocaust as completely from God's hand. That's what you would think. Whereas if you're a Maimonidean, if you're a rationalist, there's more emphasis on people's actions. There's more emphasis on people's actions. And this is why, this is a famous quote, definitely not my own. People often say, where was God in the Holocaust? And then we often say, where were people in the Holocaust? So that would be another sort of traditional type of thought or philosophy, is that God doesn't always involve himself or herself. God doesn't have a gender in the actions of people, but people themselves have choices. Okay, so let's get now specifically into our main topic here about what is Hasidic philosophies of the Holocaust, and then we're going to get to actions of the Holocaust, and then we're going to touch on a few topics related to that. Okay. So what are the main books of the Holocaust, of Hasidic thought in the Holocaust? Does anybody here know? Does anybody know what books were written during the Holocaust on Hasidic thought?
Interesting.
So there wasn't a lot, but there were two major ones. And the funny thing about them is, again, when you're talking about the majority of the Jewish people that were religious, believed in Hasidic thought, and there were only a few books written, and they're clear those books are not a true sample of what everybody believed or thought. You can definitely, it's hard to, you can't say a huge amount of people and a huge amount of rebbes and a huge amount of thinkers that only two books define it, and certainly they don't. But the two books that we have extant from the Holocaust are the Eish Kodesh, first of all. You guys heard of the Eish Kodesh, the Piaseczner Rebbe? And the second one is Ema Banim Smecha. Right? Those are the two ones, written by Rabbi Shlomo Techtal. So I'll just cover quickly those two because these names are going to come up many times. So the Eish Kodesh is the Piaseczner Rebbe. So I'll give you a specific name. Was a Rebbe who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto and was murdered in the Holocaust. His name was Rabbi Clonimus Kalma Shapiro. He died in he died in the Holocaust in 1943 in the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. And what was unique about him is that he used to give the Warsaw Ghetto. There was, even though the conditions were getting worse and worse, there was an active Jewish life happening in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he would still speak. And after Shabbos, he would write down his ideas in a book. And this book became something called the Eish Kodesh, the sacred fire, the holy fire. And he is just such a radically awesome writer and thinker. And his books are readily available in English. So if any of you don't have amazing Hebrew skills, you can buy his books. One's called Holy Fire, another one's called Sacred Fire. There's a few different translations. And they're just mind-blowing. I mean, they're just mind-blowing. He going through the things he was going through, he was very much radical in his thinking. And some of his ideas we will touch on today. But I mean, he really wrote about 10 or 12 books. So why do we even have Eish Kodesh? Why do we even have his books? So you know what happened? It's really a miracle. You know about Hashgacha Pratis. He buried his books in the ghetto, and the ghetto was burned down. And after the war, a Polish boy found the books buried in the rubble. And with the books, there was a note saying, "Please send my works to my cousin who lived in Tel Aviv." And that's what happened. And only because of this, these books were even found. Wow. So as far as actual Hasidic writers, he is probably the main one you're going to find during the Holocaust. Now, there are many Rebbes who were murdered in the Holocaust, and some who survived and went on to move to the U.S. or Israel and founded or continued their Hasidis there. But he is such a genius and brilliant and amazing person. The second one is a very unique and controversial book, but it's very hard to say it's representative of Hasidic thought in general, but nevertheless, it really does deserve mentioning because of the obvious ramifications of the Holocaust on the founding of the State of Israel. Rabbi Shlomo Techtal was a Hungarian Rebbe. Not a Rebbe, he was a Hungarian rabbi, and he was against Zionism. And we're going to talk about the Hasidic opposition to Zionism and how that works out later in the class, but he was opposed to Zionism, but he was in Hungary, and during the Holocaust, he sort of, I would say, had what I would call an epiphany, and he believed that Hasidic groups and the rabbis were wrong for opposing Zionism, and that he wrote a whole tractate called Ema Banim Smecha, which, it says, mother with children is happy, right? That's a famous pasuk from the Torah. Maybe it's Tehillim, I think. I don't know. Somewhere in the Tanakh. And there he gives many sources. What's so unique about his level of scholarship was that he wrote the whole book with sources with no access to books. He was such a scholar that he had so many books memorized that he wrote this whole book in like a year in Hungary before he ended up being murdered. I'm not sure how the book got out. I guess there were some survivors of the Hungarian Holocaust. So I mean, I'm sure I could find but he himself was murdered. So he was a staunch anti-Zionist Hasidic thinker who, let's say, he completely changed his mind during the Holocaust and basically came to the conclusion that we were wrong and we should have, gotten out while we could have. But it's more than that. That wasn't really what the whole book was about. The whole book was about the redemption, how the redemption is going to come, suffering. The book's huge. I mean, it's a huge book full of all sorts of different ideas. So, but again, I don't want to say that book is typical of Hasidic thought during the Holocaust, but it's an important thought. It's an important book because it made its way out, and it's an important book particularly for religious Zionists, though he himself wouldn't be part of any movement like that. But it is a source book for religious Zionist thought, even though he himself was a Hungarian Hasidic rabbi, which doesn't, usually align with the way religious Zionism, perpetuated after the Holocaust and the founding of the State of Israel. Okay, so let's get to some of the specific philosophies. And we touched a little bit on it. But first, let's stop for a second and take a breath. Does anyone here have any questions or comments about anything I've said so far? What's your name?
Brett.
Hi, Brett.
This is a random question which you might not have knowledge of, but I'm just curious. Like, by the end of the Holocaust and the end of World War II, if there were any Jews really in Europe who were not Zionists at that point, did they have some, like, was their proposal of what to do if not found the State of Israel just move to the U.S.? Like, what was there a consensus sort of game plan of what Plan B was, or
after the Holocaust?
Yeah, other than found the State of Israel, of some like large scale action that could be.
I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I could tell you this: that my previous job for 7.5 years was working at a Jewish hospital in Canada, which had the largest amount of Holocaust survivors in Canada at the time. And I knew many of these people and spoke to many of these people. Some of these people were heroes. Some of them were just regular people, men and women of all sorts. And I can say this is that generally in the DP camps, people went wherever they got their visa first. Britain was actively keeping people from going to Israel. I could give a whole other class about Zionism and stuff like that. I know a lot about it, but they were actively keeping people there. So the people who got to Israel were the people who managed to sneak in. Either the Jewish brigade got them in or other different things like that. But it got to a point where, the trouble in Israel was at a height that it was very hard to get to Israel. And not everyone wanted to go to Israel because they heard what was going on there as far as like, okay, we just got out of this hell in Europe. And now we're going to go someplace where there's a war happening. And, the Jews were not just fighting the Arabs in 1948. They had been fighting for decades before that. There were problems, right? There were all sorts of, massacres and things like that. They just wanted to go to a place that was safe. So some people managed to go to Palestine and, Israel eventually in 1948. But others went where their visa came. And some, the visas, first they got a visa from Canada, they went to Canada. If they first got a visa to the U.S., they went to the U.S., wherever they could go. There were thinkers and leaders who were saying, obviously Zionism was a big, powerful movement before the war. And so there were a lot of people who were saying, hey, come here, we need you, come join us, stuff like that. But there were plenty of people who, either because they were not Zionist or because they were just practical, regular people who just wanted to start their life again, moved to the U.S. or Canada, So I don't know where the majority of them went. I imagine, probably mostly between Israel and the U.S.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I want to talk about, not first. I want to talk about evil, the problem of evil, which is really the big problem, right? Suffering and evil is the problem of all religion. Do you have a question? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Because obviously the Holocaust is an unprecedented level of evil, and how does Judaism and specifically how does Hasidic thought deal with evil? And again, how does that inform how people thought and acted during the Holocaust? So the Torah itself seems to have some rather scary aspects to it regarding evil. God is portrayed sometimes as being vengeful. Now, that is always tinged with mercy at times, but it does say in a few places in the Torah, one of which is going to be my son's bar mitzvah portion, kitavo, if you don't follow my commandments and you don't do all the right things, all these terrible curses are going to fall upon you. And we even say it in the Shema every day. We say Shema, and then we say the V'ahavta, and then we say the V'haya im Shemoah. And if you look at the text there, basic Judaism in the Torah, it seems to be on a simple person's level, is very reward and punishment oriented. If you do the mitzvah, God's going to give you everything good. If you don't, God's going to punish you. But I would also say, if you look deeper in the Torah, you will also find plenty and plenty and plenty of examples of God's kindness as well. I mean, God saving us from destruction, the golden calf, the 13 attributes of mercy, all sorts of amazing things that God does. But generally, there does seem to be a sense of a very strict sense of reward and punishment within the Torah. So does God create evil? That's a good question. That's an old question. It says in Isaiah, this is the pasuk says, in 45:7, Yotzer or uvrei choshech, ose shalom uvrei ra, ani Hashem osa kol ela. He creates light, he forms light and creates darkness. He makes peace and creates evil. I am the God who does all of this. So Isaiah seems to say that God makes evil. But what's interesting, where do we see this pasuk or some version of this pasuk? Does anyone here know? In the liturgy, we see this pasuk, but it's changed. The first line of Shacharit, of Shachris, we say Yotzer or uvrei choshech, ose shalom uvrei es hakol. Already by the time we get to the sages of the men of the Great Assembly who formed a liturgy, it's already, there's like kind of taking that out. They're not saying God creates evil, right? It's funny because there's already by the time of the rabbinic period, there's already, I would say, like a liberalization and softening a little bit of that aspect of that, right? There's also, we say in Eicha, by the way, in Lamentations, it says, from God comes the good and the bad. So it does seem to be that God makes bad, right? But it seems to be getting softened up. And throughout the Gemara, just for purposes of time here, I'm not going to go through the many different Gemaras, but there are many Gemaras which kind of talk about many really things bad things could happen to people. And it doesn't say that it's always from God. Sometimes it just kind of says it could be an accident or people could do it. And as I already said earlier, Rambam and the medieval philosophers and others have a similar opinion to the Rambam, where the Rambam, Maimonides, basically says evil comes for three reasons. And he doesn't ever say God does it. He noticeably doesn't say God does evil. He says three reasons. One, God created people as a physical nature, and the nature of physicality is to deteriorate, right? To deteriorate. So all flesh ultimately comes to a certain end. So that's the nature of world, I guess we call it now, is entropy. The nature of the world is entropy, and everything ultimately breaks down. And to get mad because of that, the second reason of evil, he says, is people doing evil. There are people in the world who do bad to other people. And the third reason for evil is one's own doing, right? If somebody drinks alcohol every night or drives their car like a mad person, and something bad happens to them, ultimately, it's they have to take responsibility. That's again the Rambam. But when you get to people like the Baal Shem Tov, he believes that everything comes from God, every single detail. So it's clear that the Hasidic philosophy is that everything is from God, right? Even in evil, there's a spark of God. Okay. So one thing that's very unique here is that there doesn't seem to be, at least according to this book, Pesach Schindler's book, there doesn't seem to be a lot of blame to God from the Hasidic Rebbes. And there really doesn't seem to be that. And nor does there seem to be a lot of blame on ourselves. Because clearly we just touched this, went on this, that it says in the Torah that if you don't follow the mitzvahs, God's going to get mad. And there's going to be all these curses. And there's pages of curses. And 2 whole parshas are dealing with these curses. Right? So, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of blame on the people or God. It's interesting. There was a book that was published a few years ago by Rabbi Avigdor Miller. And Rabbi Avigdor Miller published a lot of books in his life, but this book was specifically not published. He was not a Hasidic thinker. And he did not publish this book. And so there was controversy around the book. I forgot what the name of the book was, but it was not published. They found it in his desk drawer after he passed away. And basically, in there, it's a whole thing about how it was the Jews' fault because we became not religious in Germany, and we followed all these non-kosher philosophies and stuff like that. And it was a very controversial book, and there's a reason why it wasn't published in his life. So people were kind of upset that Rabbi Avigdor Miller, again, who wasn't a Hasidic rabbi, but he was a very staunchly Orthodox rabbi, why he didn't publish this, but why he would say such things. But you don't see such an idea among the Hasidic thinkers. You really don't, at least according to this book. You don't see them blaming the people. Really, there's such a humanitarian aspect, and really the job of Hasidic leaders, the Rebbe, was always to comfort the people. And we see that they're going on, I guess this is going to be something we'll touch on later, but I'm just going to say it now because I don't want to drag out everything, is a lot of the Rebbes, these guys were huge guys and they had a lot of connections. A lot of Rebbes could have been saved by the Holocaust, and they chose not to be. They chose to go and die with their followers. And not everybody. There were some guys who went out and they were considered criticized for that. I'm not going to say any names, but some of the rabbis did get out. But most of them went and said, "I'm not leaving my people." And they were there to comfort and be there with their people. Again, that touches more on the comforting and the coping aspects, which is for later. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of blaming God or blaming people, the actual people, for the Holocaust. However, the Eish Kodesh, which I mentioned earlier, P.S. Eshner Rebbe, does have a unique position where he actually, unfortunately, it was a horrible, horrible thing that the Eish Kodesh's son died during the Holocaust. And he has a very famous Torah about that. But there's another thing he says about that is he blamed his own sins for that. He blamed his own sins for that. So, do you guys know the Hebrew term in the Torah for when God hides his face?
So that was when God hides his face?
Yeah. It's called Hester Panim, right? Aniya Aster et Panim. By the curses, God says, I will hide my face during that time. And so Hester Panim means the hiding of God. And it's this idea that God, we don't always see God through everything. So Hester Panim is like a clear way, it's something that clearly it's an idea that always existed ever since the revelation of the Torah, that this idea that God sometimes hides and lets things just go according to its being. And in some ways, it could be considered a chesed, according to certain Rebbes. The Ishbitzer says something about that, as well as the Eish Kodesh. The Ishbitzer wasn't alive in the time of the Holocaust, but one of his descendants was, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But Hester Panim could be positive in a way, because, like, let's say you're a parent, and your children are spoiled, and you're giving them everything all the time. Sometimes it's good as a parent to let go and let people activate on their own. Speaking of the Baal Shem Tov, there's a very beautiful Baal Shem Tov Torah about this, right? On the pasuk, Huyan Genu Al Mus, Hashem will guide you over death. What does it mean Hashem will guide you over death? It says when a parent is raising a baby and you want the baby to walk, you don't hold the baby like this. The baby won't walk. At some point, you have to let go so that the baby will have the confidence to walk on their own. And that's the baby won't walk on its own. And that's what Hester Panim is, according to the Baal Shem Tov. It's like God's there, but just a little bit distant, a little bit away, so that you yourself can act. And that really is a little bit of it, like we're going to get to at the end. You know, Tom's criticism of the Hasidic Rebbes, which I agree with her about, is that, you know, and again, very few people want to connect spiritually the Holocaust to the creation of the state of Israel, but clearly politically and facts on the ground, there's obvious connection that it didn't happen. One didn't happen until the other happened, right? And in some way, and I'm saying this, not any of these sources, you know, in a way, the Jewish people had been subjugated for so long that we had become a philosophy that was so spiritually oriented that we couldn't do anything. We became a people without power. And in some way, and I mean, I'm definitely the first one to say this. If you go to Yad Vashem today, there's a very famous and controversial 2 statues outside Yad Vashem. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? One statue shows these Jews like this, all huddled, the huddled masses of Eastern Europe, and they're all probably being pushed on their way to their final solution. And then next to it is the great leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto, and they were standing up like these, you know, Greek and Roman heroes, brave with the gun and this, you know, and it's like you're supposed to juxtapose the two. And, you know, you can call it propaganda, but there is something to be said is that until the Zionist movement around the beginning of 1900, Jews were not really politically active to say we can solve our problems through political and active means. Hasidic thought, for the beauty of it, in a lot of ways, would be what we call a quietist movement. Do you guys know what quietism is?
Yes.
So what's quietism?
Quietism is kind of came out of, as I understand it, came out of like Quaker thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, where you're not, like when the Quakers pray, they don't speak. They sit in silence until what they call the Holy Spirit moves them to speak. And they're also pacifists and everything like that. So yeah, I can see where that would have come into play.
So as I said earlier, I'm getting a master's. It's beautiful, and you're totally correct. So I'm getting a master's of theology at the U of T, and it's given me a chance to talk with all sorts of people of different religions, right? It's definitely not a Jewish program specifically. So we had a Quaker teacher come in once, and he said, he's a young guy, and he said he's married with some kids, and he said, if someone were coming to kill me or my family, I would let them. And I was just shocked, and so were even all the Christians in the room were shocked. It's just like, no, like, of course not. You wouldn't do that, But that's what quietism is. Now, clearly, Hasidic is not that extreme, but I would say in general, I think what and also what getting into the concept of Zionism or not, is that Hasidic thought in a lot of ways had gotten to the point where the Jew, their power was solely in the spiritual realms. I don't think this just started in the Hasidic movement. Clearly, we see after the destruction of the Second Temple 2,000 years before, there was already a movement, a trend among people say like, we're now a people of the Gullus. We're now a diasporic people. And now things like, it's like we used to do sacrifices in the temple. Now the sacrifices turned into prayers that we say. We didn't have power anymore. And the truth is, it's not only among Jews you see this. Among all types of people, religious movements who are oppressed, suddenly their activism turns to passive, spiritual forms of activism. A great example for this is, have you guys ever read Bury My Heart at what is it? Wounded Knee,
Yeah.
right, by D. Brown. And there they talk about something called the Great Ghost Dance. So at first, when the indigenous peoples of America, what they call Turtle Island, were here, and people came and colonized, this place that we live in, the great country that we live in, it was first, a bunch of indigenous people lived here. Mm-hmm. There was first active resistance to this. But it got to a certain point by the 1850s where it was like, there's only one side was going to win. And that book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, really talks about this. But it's interesting, the active resistance to the American colonials, it morphed into something called the Great Ghost Dance, where these spiritual leaders of the indigenous people would get together and they'd do these dances, and they'd wear these clothing. It's interesting, almost like tzitzis, and they'd say these would stop bullets, and everything became spiritualized. So you see this as well, that is really in a lot of ways what had happened to the Jewish people, and you see that really exemplified in the Hasidic movement, that eventually we sort of became so weak that our whole religion basically was based on
I'm trying to mute. Guy, can you mute? Thank you.
Yeah, on spiritual principles as opposed to active principles. I took a course by Professor Ken Green a couple years ago, and he really talked about this. And really, there were very few examples of political efforts to get the Jews out of the dilemma they were in, which I'm not going to touch in. But obviously, the Jews were in a big dilemma for thousands of years. But Hasidic thought, in a lot of ways, was a perpetuation of that. And yeah, so I'm going to skip past some of the stuff because I know we're going on a little here and I don't want to go on forever. Okay, so I did say there wasn't a lot of questioning of God, and I don't want to say that exactly is true. Sometimes there was some questioning of God. There was a tradition within Hasidic thought, started from the first Rebbe called Rebbe Levi Yitzhak Aberdichev, the Kedushas Levi, one of the first Rebbes, where he would challenge God and get upset at God for hurting the people. For instance, he would give an example like this. He says, so people know that it says in the Talmud, on a tefillin, it has God's names. But it says in the Talmud that God, so to speak, this is a metaphor obviously, wears tefillin. And what does it say in God's tefillin? It has the name of us. We have the name of God because God's our beloved, but we're God's beloved. It has our name on God's tefillin. So Levi Yitzhak already, this is a couple hundred years before, challenges God and says, God, you see a simple Jew will drop his tefillin on the ground and he'll devotedly pick it up and hold it and kiss it. God, we're your tefillin. When are you going to pick us up and hold us and kiss us? When are you going to get us out of this bitter exile? Because it didn't just start with the Holocaust. We all know that this stuff was going on for 2,000 years, but particularly bad at certain periods of time, like the Middle Ages in Christian Europe and all the pogroms in Eastern Europe, right? So there were other examples of this. For instance, there's a story where this Hasid named Aaron Rappaport asked his Rebbe, the Ossifer Rebbe, so is this the Torah and this is its reward? This is what we've been doing. We've been good Jews, and this is what happens. We know that in the Holocaust, it didn't matter whether you're the most secular person who loved eating bacon, lettuce, and cheese sandwiches, or whether you were the biggest Rebbe. It didn't matter. God took everybody. Every Jew was equal in the Holocaust in that regard. And there was a tradition of activism in that regard. Okay. So, so I'm going to skip some of these Torahs just to move on so that we can get towards the apex of the class here. Okay. So what about sacrifice? So this is going to be hard to swallow. And this is something that a lot of us as Jews aren't going to love. But there was some traditions where, for instance, the Belzer Rebbe during the Holocaust, his son was one of the Jews who was burned up in one of the synagogues. Sometimes the Nazis would get people and put them in a synagogue and they would just burn the whole synagogue down. And the Belzer Rebbe said his son was a sacrifice to Hashem. And it's such a dark thought because we don't have this type of things in Judaism. But I think the most powerful Torah that I ever heard was the Eish Kodesh, the Piaseczny Rebbe, which basically said this. And he said the same thing after his son was killed in the Holocaust. This is what he said. He said, people think the Akedah of Yitzhak. Everyone knows about the binding of Isaac. And at the end, God saved him and Isaac wasn't killed. And this is what the Piaseczny Rebbe said. He says, people thought that Isaac wasn't killed in the Holocaust, killed in the binding of Isaac, in the Akedah. But it's not true. Every Jew who's dying today is a fulfillment of the binding of Isaac. Everyone who dies. He says, the binding of Isaac was a kavana without a maisa. Meaning as Avraham intended Isaac to be killed, because that's what God seemingly had told him to do, but it never actually happened. So it was an intention without an action. The Piaseczny Rebbe said the Holocaust was the opposite. It was an action with no intention. There was nothing holy or anything done about it, but it was done. And all the Jews who died in the Holocaust was a fulfillment of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac. It's dark, it's hard, but there is this element of sacrifice there. Similarly, there's a story in the holy book called Eitz Chaim, which is the deepest Kabbalah book, where he says the 10 martyrs who were murdered at the time of the Romans. We read about them on Yom Kippur, we talk about them in Tisha B'Av, that those were almost like a sacrifice, like a sacrificial, a loss that the Jewish people had to have in order to prevent worse things from happening. And some people actually believe that we were so far gone. We're talking about Egypt, we're talking about the Exodus, right? And there's this idea there that it's also a very hard idea that only 20% of the Jews got out of Egypt. 80% of them were lost in the plague of darkness. So there is these very deep and dark ideas found throughout the tradition that there were Jews who were sacrificed along the way in order for greater purposes. And it's not something that I like, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about that there was some strain of thought that some people believe that this sort of had to happen. And obviously, from Zionistic thought, they might say, again, the Holocaust had to happen in order to get to the state of Israel. Okay, so we had some very, very heavy stuff there. So I just want to lay back for a second. We have some new people here. And also to see if you have any questions at this point before we kind of get to, since we have some new people, I don't want to end so quick, but we'll end in about 15 minutes. Any questions up to what I or comments up to what I said so far?
Yes, I definitely does not sit right, which I know that you would expect. It doesn't sit right that we have the binding of Isaac kind of happening in the Holocaust, because a lot of explanations for for avoiding binding Isaac was that no, well, actually, other cultures do this. They sacrifice their children, and we're not going to do this. And so that kind of just doesn't sit right, because that was one of the explanations I always learned about. So very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. You have to keep in mind, this is one Rebbe thinking this. He was an important Rebbe, but he wasn't this. I don't want to represent for everyone's different opinion. A lot of people, other responses were just simple faith. Obviously that as well. So I want to take a story about a crazy story about a very special woman in the Holocaust. And her name is actually called the Holy Woman. And I found her book in Israel. She survived the Holocaust. And the Holy Woman, someone once asked her, how did you get through the Holocaust? Right? And they said, it was so evil and it was so bad. And this is what she said. I couldn't believe this or read this in the book. It was just like mind-blowing to me. She said, the Holocaust wasn't bad. She said, in the concentration camp, me and all the women together, we took care of each other. We loved each other. We had such kindness and such giving to each other. And that's the way she saw it. And it's incomprehensible for most of us to hear such a thing. But I think that there's a unique perspective of being able to see the good in everything, even despite the worst circumstances, that can enable somebody to get through. As a chaplain and as a psychotherapist, I can tell you that people who have something to believe in, this is Viktor Frankl. You guys, how many of you guys have read Viktor Frankl, Man's Search of Meaning, right? That's his whole thesis, and that's probably a lot of the work I do with my clients, is if you have a sense of purpose and meaning, you can overcome almost anything. And then you got to read this book, Man's Search for Meaning. I mean, it's a brilliant book. You'll read it in 2 days. It's a wonderful book, and it informs a lot of my practice. But she saw the positive because she saw the Holocaust as a way for other women. I mean, she was separated in the camp, so the women lived together, the men lived together. And this is something unique. I didn't see this in particular in this study, but I had seen this in other Holocaust studies, that in the camps, women oftentimes did better than men. Men tend to isolate more, whereas women tend to be more communal oriented. So there seems to be that seems to be something that obviously, when it came to a selection or something like that, no, it didn't matter, whatever. But when it came to the fact that a lot of people withered away in the camps, lonely, isolated, hungry, sick. And when you have other people to care for you, I mean, we saw this a lot during the pandemic. People got really sick from just not being around people. It's so important. So she was able to see the good point in the Holocaust, believe it or not, The Holy Woman. You can buy her book. You can find it on Amazon or something. It's just called The Holy Woman. That she through the kindness and giving. So that kind of gets us to our second to last topic, which is coping with the Holocaust. How did people cope? We talked about some of the philosophies. And again, I only touched on like 1/100th of what I even have found in this book. So don't have enough time. But how do people cope with the Holocaust? Acceptance of reality, and I think this is something that we all have to deal with, is an answer. That kind of gets into that quietistic thing. Mm-hmm. However, okay, and then community. We already spoke about how women got together, but there were other examples of that. The Rebbe and the Hasidic movement particularly was very community oriented. They get together on Shabbat. They'd sing songs. They'd share food together. The Rebbe would be part of them. So when these Rebbes, a lot of them could have been saved, and they chose to go to the death camps with their followers, and that gave the followers faith, to see that these Rebbes would be with them and have that connection. Even in the camps, there was all sorts of stories, not just among Hasidim, of people managing any little bit of Judaism that they could manage there. There was sometimes a little Rebbe's tish, like the special table they would have there. All sorts of stories. So here's a story. Have you guys ever read the book Hasidic Tales from the Holocaust by Yafa Eliach? Very powerful book as well. She was a scholar at Brooklyn College, and she interviewed a number of people and got unique stories of the Holocaust. Great, powerful book. So the first story of the Holocaust basically goes like this, and I think of this book goes like this, and I think it's very apropos to what we're saying. There was a Rebbe, and there was an enlightened Jew, meaning a secular Jew, and together they were in the Holocaust. and they were in the same camp together. And this Rebbe's name was Rabbi Yisrael Spira, the Blues-Over Rebbe, and he survived and lived in Brooklyn. So this secular Jew, enlightened Jew, basically kept asking the Rebbe, where's God? Where's God in the Holocaust? And they would argue, something like you get the Rebbe, the scholar, the man of faith, and it's sort of like those videos of like the guy who believes in God and the guy who's a scientist. I'm talking about like Bill Nye, the science guy, arguing with like a creationist or something like that. They'd have these guys dialogue in the camps, and so then they got to a point where the Nazis basically decided they were going to liquidate that bunk, or that section of the camp, and the Nazis built a big pit. And on the other end of the pit, there was a guy with a machine gun. And the Nazis, some of them were just obviously extremely sadistic people. And they said, okay, Jews, we're not just going to kill all of you. Any of you guys who could jump across this pit, the pit was far, to the other side, you'll survive. But anyone else, you're gone for. And so basically there was a lineup, and unfortunately the Jews were jumping. And it was impossible. First of all, even a regular healthy person couldn't make it across this pit. But particularly someone who isn't eating, and is suffering. And the pit was filling up with people, with bodies. And the Rebbe and the Blues-Over Rebbe and the enlightened friend were talking, and he says, where's God now? Where's God? Is he going to help us? Is he going to help us? And they finally got to the end. And he said, this is what he said. He said, the Rebbe turned to him and he said, listen, hold my hand, and when I say jump, jump, right? And so they got to the end, and they closed their eyes, and he said, jump. And they closed their eyes, and they opened their eyes, and they were standing on the other side of the pit. And it's one of those stories that's given in there like a matter-of-fact thing. So I'm not going to speak. I never will ever speak against whether a story happened or didn't happen. But it's brought there as a story that actually happened. And I have no reason to believe this Holocaust survivor, this holy person, made it up. And so the enlightened Jew who had just been saved turned to the Rebbe and he asked him, he said, Rebbe, what were you thinking of when we, he held the Rebbe's hand, they jumped across, and suddenly they woke up, they opened their eyes, and they were on the other side of the pit. What were you thinking of? He says, I was thinking of all my holy ancestors and all the holy things that they had done. That's how I got across. And so the Rebbe said, well, what about you? And he said, I was holding on to you. And I think this story, and there's a reason why it's the first story in that book, is it really exemplifies like the Hasidic faith of the Hasidic person. Faith in their Rebbe, faith in God. And even just on a scientific level, as a psychotherapist, as a chaplain, as a rabbi, I can tell you that people of faith, it helps you. It helps you have that meaning that Viktor Frankl talks about to get through the difficulties in life. So the last thing I want to do in this section before we get to the final section is talk about action. And this is where Tom, hopefully we'll get a chance to listen to this later. Did the Rebbe's do anything physically? And this is a bigger question we can ask about. People nowadays say, how could we not stand there? How could we not stand up? Again, I'm not going to delve into the topic because I'm sure all of you guys have heard a lot about this topic in the past. Okay?
Sorry.
It's okay. As I had said, there was sort of a tradition, unfortunately, that Jews, as we lost power over the thousands of years of exile, had lost a lot of our physical might in order to be active participants in the world other than in spiritual things. And this is definitely exemplified by the Jews of Eastern Europe. I mean, in World War I, Jews served in all the armies. They served in the German army, they served in the Russian army, they served in the American army, they served in the British army. World War II, also Jews served in all those different armies. Obviously, they didn't serve in the German army in World War II. But among Hasidic people, there was definitely an aversion to the world. And that being said, a lot of people did stand up. We don't know about what happened in all the camps because these people all were wiped out. But there are many examples of religious people standing up and doing whatever little they could against a foe who was much stronger. So my Rebbe, his name is the Ridziner Rebbe. He lives in Bayit Vagan. And in his family, there was a Rebbe another Ridziner Rebbe named Shmuel Leiner, and he was called the Partisaner Rebbe. And he told his followers, go to the woods, get out, and do fight. And he himself, the Nazis had come, the Radziner Rebbe, the Nazis had come to his place, and they know that he was actively making resistance groups, and they came to look for him, and they found him, and they were about to shoot the Rebbe, and they said to the Rebbe, they said, okay, what's your last wish? He said, oh, one sec, I've like something in my shoe. He got down, he got his shoe, smacked the Nazi across the face with his shoe, and they shot him dead. But again, I think Tom's criticism of the Hasidic movement in general is a valid one, and that there were opportunities for some Rebbes. Again, hindsight is 2020, but there was opportunities for some Rebbes decades before the Holocaust to get their followers out, and they didn't. And as well as, like she had said, there were Hasidic Rebbes who said everything's going to be okay. Like, you can have too much faith. If you see someone coming to harm you, you got to stand up and do something about it. But some of the people did have too much faith, and they said everything's going to be okay, and everything's going to be okay, and ultimately it wasn't okay. And ultimately people were killed for that. But there's a famous example. The great rabbi, the Rav Kook, who was really the spiritual head of the Zionist movement, but he died before the Holocaust happened. He was the chief rabbi of Israel, very interesting person, very interesting thinker, very into his stuff. And actually, Yehuda Cohen, who's going to speak Saturday night, a good friend of mine, is a big scholar in Rav Kook. And Saturday night, I think at the Kollel, Yehuda Cohen is going to speak about Rav Kook. And Yehuda Cohen's a brilliant activist. And also, I want you to know this, for those of you who have different thoughts about Zionism and stuff, he is understander and dialogues with Palestinians and stuff like that too. He's a very unique person. And I knew him 20 years ago when he was like a Kahananik, and he's now more of a Rav Kooknik, and he does a lot of dialogue with Palestinians and stuff like that. So he's a really interesting thinker, really dynamic guy. Really should see him. He didn't tell me to put up this. I'm just very excited that him and I happen to be in town at the same time. Because I'm from here, he's not. But there was an incident in Rav Kook's lifetime where the Belzer Rebbe, who literally had hundreds of thousands of Hasidim in Poland, came in the 1920s to Israel to see about settling the Jews of Poland and Israel. And he was so big, the Belzer Rebbe, that was the Belzer Rebbe, is the Gera Rebbe, excuse me, the Gera Rebbe, that he could have influenced hundreds of thousands of Jews to get out. But ultimately he declined. And again, I'm not a believer that everyone has perfect knowledge and foresight. These Rebbes didn't, and they made a mistake. No, it's easy to look back and judge them now, but yes, there was some fault by, again, the thinking that we had. I don't have time for it today, but there's reasons why the Hasidic movement was generally anti-Zionistic, and I don't believe it's a Torah reason. I believe it was a social reason.
An agadic reason.
Yeah, there's the agadic reason of the three Shavuos, the three oaths in Gemara Ketubos 111. But I think that there was more than that. I don't want to get into the whole thing about it, but I do want to end with my last part, which is Zionism. I touched a lot on it. Actually, almost everything about Zionism I already touched on here. But okay, I will say it now. Saying is that AP, at least according to my belief, I don't think it was. Again, people can argue with me, and they do argue with me because I'm a staunch Zionist. But I'm not like a hardcore person. I believe in justice for all people, all that kind of stuff. But I do believe Zionism, is really, I would say, like one of my core beliefs as a Jew. Everyone's entitled to their own beliefs. I have lots of friends who are anti-Zionist or just neutral. Not going to judge. You all have your sources. But I think that one of the reasons, besides the sources in the books, AP, I think personally, my opinion of one of the reasons that some of the Hasidic movements and a lot of the ultra-Orthodox people were anti-Zionist had to do with the sociological reasons of the Enlightenment period. That suddenly, I don't have to give you the whole history of modern Judaism, but I have to give you a 30-second synopsis. Suddenly, the Jews were now free members of society. And a lot of people very quickly became disinterested in Judaism or became enlightened Jews. The Reform movement started. And I think it all happened so quickly that a lot of the staunch Eastern European Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox Lithuanian people didn't like what was happening. They didn't like what was happening. So I think there was like a sociological revulsion to the Zionistic movement. I don't think it was purely based in Torah sources, though you can find any Torah sources for anything if you look for it. I believe it was a lot of sociological reasons that they didn't like the enlightened people. You looked at a guy like Herzl. He didn't know anything about Torah, but you can't blame the guy. He grew up in a secular life. He didn't know anything about religion. but he founded the Zionistic movement. So you get this guy who's living in Eastern Europe who's very religious, and then you see we're going to suddenly follow somebody who has no connection to Torah whatsoever. No, we're not going to follow him. So that's my belief on one foot about why there was a lot of resistance to Zionism.
I can affirm that coming from a Hasidic background. So in the yeshiva, the same thing. Like they would not study Tanakh. They would not study like the prophets or the Ketuvim unless it was like the Parsha, because that was what the Zionists did.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a revolt to do
Yeah.
to not do what the Zionists did, because that was they saw it as like a sprouting of the Haskalah, of the Enlightenment. So yeah, there was like it's very like anti-Zionist, but not anti-Israel necessarily.
And further, what I said, the face of the opinion is that God is the foundation that God has, but the root of it is, as you said, we want to create in Israel, but we want Israel to be in our image, and we can't have Israel. This is literally what the responso was from Adis Haredi.
Yeah.
That's literally the response. Like, well, we cannot support the Zionist movement because these Jews do not have our Torah values. Like, well, none of the Jews that came into Israel were religious when 3,250 years ago. None of them. Most of them completely just like today. Look at the demographics. We've watched our more Haredi brethren criticize secular Jews who literally did a mitzvah to take the land.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I think Rav Kook's Torah is really the synthesis between all those traditional Torahs and the Zionists. And he was a friend for everyone. But I'll let Yehuda Cohen speak about that Saturday night, because I know he's specifically speaking about Rabbi Kook, and beautiful revolutionary thinker, Rabbi Kook. So just to end up here, again, there's so much more we can do about all of this, talk about all this, but I've been speaking for almost an hour. So I just want to answer questions, and I already kind of did answer them. We can see that the main question was, does Hasidic thought help people or hinder people, or both? And we see the answer to that is Hasidic thought comforted people with faith, with community, with beautiful Torahs and the Rebbes having self-sacrifice. But as we just spoke about it, also you could say it hindered some people because it didn't enable us to be active to help save ourselves. If we were possible to save ourselves, I mean, it's pretty hard to argue that Jews really could have done it much on a communal level to save ourselves in Europe, you know. But we don't have that situation nowadays. We have other challenges, but we do have the ability to defend ourselves nowadays. So I'll just leave it at that. I spoke for a long time, and I don't think I have much more energy to speak more. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, the source books you can look at. This book you're not going to find easily. I ordered this. I probably paid like a lot for it because it's like old out of print book. But Hasidic response to the Holocaust, a lot of good stuff in here. But I think if you really want to hear the beautiful Torahs, you can read Eish Kodesh, which you shouldn't have trouble finding in English or Hebrew. It's called Sacred Fire or Holy Fire. There's a couple translations of it. That's a Pizeshna Rebbe. And then there's Ema Banim Smicha by Rabbi Shlomo Tektal. So any questions, comments? Thank you, AP, for your insightful thoughts as well. Okay, well, I thank you guys for coming. I'm going to be around on Shabbos if any of you guys are around. You can look me up. I'm also in the Tucson Jews chat. And other than that, you can reach out to me. My information's there on Zoom. I'm a psychotherapist. I like to help people. Could talk Torah, or if you wanted to get some help, any type of thing, I'm available for you guys. But I love coming here to Tucson. I love the community. I'm really, really glad I made the connection with this couple. I had been coming to Tucson before, and I was kind of like, what do I do here on Shabbos? What do I do? And like, this grassroots Judaism is what I love. Like, this makes me feel like I'm coming back to Tucson. This is where I grew up. And it's just lovely to see that there's community here and you guys are out there coming to a class. Thank you for supporting me, coming to my class. I really appreciate that. Makes me feel what I'm doing is worthwhile. My studies at the university and 10 years in yeshiva and all that stuff. So God bless. Good to see everybody.
Wow.
Thank you. Thanks.